We're now on Daf Mem Gimel and Beis. And the Gemara says the following. Let's distinguish in the context of Mishola B'en Or between the limb, an aver of an animal, and the kometz mincha. Aver, in the case of a limb of an animal, dimichaber. Bechaber means that the entire limb is one unit, one entity. And if part of the limb is already Mishola B'en Or, it's as if the entire limb was burnt on the Mizbeach, and therefore in Yardu, Yal. Aval kometz de mifras. Kometz, which is made of flour, is mifras. Mifras means you can break it down into small segments. There's nothing that unites and unifies the entire kometz as one entity. Ema lo. Therefore, if not for Ula, I would have thought that only that part of the kometz that was actually burnt by the or, by the fire on top of the mizbech, that part, if it falls down, you have to bring it back up. And the halach of lechem mizbech will apply to that part that was burnt. But the other particles, the other segments of this kometz, which was not shola b'en or, there was no others. If that falls off the mizbeach, then it's not one entity that you could say, well, it's as if the entire kometz was burned. No. It was separate. Komashmal, and that's what Ula wants to be machadish here, that even in a case where part of the kometz was burnt on the mizbeach, which it shouldn't have been done, but in olu lo yerdu, if that the other part of the kometz is on the ground, it never reached the mizbeach, then I would have said that that part that's on the ground is lo yalu. You're not allowed to bring it back up. It was not part of an entity that on which you could say, oh, because we break up the parts of the kometz into individual parts. Now, I'm not 100% sure about what I'm about to tell you, but I think it's correct. And maybe we'll find it in the notes. I don't find it yet. That when Ula says that even the part of the kometz that's on the ground and is not on the mizbech, it has to be brought up on the mizbech. I think that Ula is talking about the fact that the whole kometz was once on the mizbech. Only part of the kometz was burnt. The other part of the kometz that was not subject to the fire fell off the mizbeach. And Ula's chiddush is that even in the case of mifres, meaning in the case of the this kometz that's made up of individual segments and particles, even that part that is not burned and is now on the ground has to be brought up on the mizbeach. But I think only because it was once on the mizbeach. So if it was once on the mizbeach and it fell from the mizbeach, now through the halacha of mashla b'hem ha'or, it gets halacha of yardu yalu, that we bring it back on top of the mizbeach. Omar v'chai hilkach hai kometz pigul demefalge mochis ha'ara. Right, so he had a kometz of a pigul, meaning that at the time of the kmitz he had in mind chutz l'zmano, and half of it mochis ha'ara. Now, I'm not sure what the word mochis means. He translates mochis as remained, right? Ara means on the ground. So it remained on the ground. Upalge aske amarocha. Now, aske means to bring it up. So it means that only half of the kometz was put on the mizbeach, umashla bo or. So it sounds like the word bo, according to Rav Achai, is referring to that part, that segment of the kometz that was brought up, right? Right? Palgi aske, on that aske, on that half that was aske, that was brought up on the altar, mashla ben or, is masikno leila kuli lechatchila. We can take the entire kometz even the half of the komets that's on the ground, and burn it on the Mizbeach. So the impression you get from Rav Achai is that he doesn't agree with what we said before, that the other half of the komets was also on the Mizbeach, but it just fell down before it was burned, and nevertheless, we can bring it back up to the Mizbeach. He says in the footnote here that because we view the entire komets as one single entity, and the burning of one part of the komets is going to impact on the entire komets and give it the status of the altar's bread, right, lechem hamizbeach, then even a part that was never brought up to the altar may be brought here. But that's, I think, the unique application of Rav Achai of the principle of Ula, taking Ula to an extreme. Even when the entire komets went up and fire took hold of only part of it, and then it came down, the part that was not on the fire is sanctified for bringing it back up by virtue of the part that was on the fire. Therefore, the burning of one particle sanctifies all the particles of the komets for bringing it up onto the Mizbeach. It therefore follows that even where the second half that was not burnt never went up on the Mizbeach, nevertheless, once the fire took place and took hold on part of the komets that did go up to Mizbeach, then the remainder may be brought up onto the Mizbeach. But in my humble opinion, again, I can't promise you that I'm right, that was the unique approach of Rav Achai. Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yochanan, Hapigul v'anoser v'atomi shehelu helon legabi Mizbeach, Paka Isur Mehen. So this formulation of Rabbi Yitzchak is really something that we're very familiar with, very at home with. And that is that all these categories of psulim, whether it's pigul or nosar or tameh, that once went up on the Mizbeach, is Paka Isur Mehen. Right? It means you now will continue to burn them on the Mizbeach. Now, in the case of pigul, that means even if it came down from the Mizbeach, you could put it back up. Again, if Sholabana or. However, he says that as far as Nosar and Tomei is concerned, the meaning here, says Rashi, is that if somebody eats the Nosar or the Tomei that was brought up on the Mizbeach, that's called him Olu, he's not Chayim. In other words, all the punishments that the Torah metes out for somebody who eats Nosar or Tomei will not apply. And Rav Chizda attacks this. He says, Mari Dechi, right? The person who said this thing, is Mizbeach Mikveh Tara? You put Tomei on the Mizbeach, so all of a sudden it becomes Tahar, and now you're allowed to eat it? We know the mikveh could be Mitayar, but not the Mizbeach. Rab Zera, that's not what I meant. Shemishola ben Or. I was referring to a case where there was already a process of burning the Tomei or the Nosar or the Pigul on top of the Mizbeach. It was a case of Mim Olu with Mishola ben Or, and now it fell down from the Mizbeach. And in such a case, the Mizbeach now acquires it as Lechem HaMizbeach, and we're going to bring it back up onto the Mizbeach. Once the fire took hold of a psul korban, the halacha is that even if, let's say, it was taken down from but the fire again took hold of it, then it can be brought up, as we said before. Now, the prohibition of offering the invalid part falls away once, okay, fine. Right? In other words, we're not talking about, somebody who eats the nosar. We're talking about the achilas mizbeach. So it doesn't mean that if the korban was tameh, now it's tahar, right? It means that prohibition of tuma, which says that you're not allowed to burn it on the mizbeach, that's removed because of shalabo moshel ben or. So again, the concept of purification here is a little bit confusing because we're not talking about removing the tumah. right? It's still also the Isurei Achilas Tum. Maser Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Bisna, he quotes a brisa that Acherim Omrim. I'm not sure, but usually Acherim is Rabbi Meir. Bitum also olav. Okay, Tumaso olav is a pasuk that. Just 1 second. Doesn't tell you where the pasuk is. Just 1 second. Oh, here it is. V'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlom asher Hashem v'tumaso olav. Very ambiguous verse in the Torah. What does olav mean? Tumaso olav means that there's tumah on the basar, and the gavra is tahar, but he's not allowed to eat a zevach tome. Or does tumas ha'olav mean that the zevach itself, the basar itself, is tahar, but the gavra is tame? So the brisa says that tumas ha'olav indicates that he still, or it is still tame, implying with the diuk that mishatum parakas mimenu, that we're only talking about that kind of tumah that's temporary and could be removed. Yatsa basar, it can't be referring to the fact that the basar contracted tumah, because basar, once it contracts tumah, can never be removed. It's not temporary, it's permanent. Ain tumah parakas, you can't remove the tumah. V'im isa, so this is how we're going to prove that the tumas olav is referring to the gavra, that he contracted tumah, and therefore he's enjoined from eating the meat of a carbon. V'im isa, according to the ruling of Rabbi Yitzchak, tuma porachas mimenu al yidei ha'ar. According to Rabbi Yitzchak, there is a way of removing the tumah, even in the case of the basar, and that is if the basar was put onto the mizbeach, which it shouldn't have been done, but once it was put on the mizbeach, if the fire consumes part of the meat or the limb of this animal, which is again tamei, then even if it falls off the mizbeach, you bring it back onto the mizbeach. That's the power of ur. So again, just like in the case of a gavra who contracted tumah, he has a way of being matayr himself by jumping into the mikveh. So too, in the case of basar of a carbon that contracted tumah, it also could be considered tumas or olav in a temporary sense, because that tumah could be removed if it's brought up onto the mizbeach. Omar Rava says, no, that's not so. They mikvah kamrinan. There's a fundamental difference here. In the case of basar, of a carbon that's possible, that came up onto the mizbeach, that's not a tara process where tumas or olav is only temporary. We remove the tumah. The tumah remains. It's only Allah that once it becomes lechem mizbeach, then we bring it back onto the mizbeach. What I was talking about in the case of a tumas gavra is that he goes into the mikveh and he removes his tumah. The Gemara is not happy. Midei mikveh ksiv. I mean, the Torah is not specifying or pinpointing mikveh. The Torah is just saying it's got to be some sort of temporary tumah that can be removed. In the case of a gavra, you remove the temporary tumah through a mikveh, fine. But in the case of basar kodshim, you remove the tumah because it was sholav v'hena or because it came onto the mizbeach and you burnt it on the mizbeach. Elam Rav Papa, so Papa gives a different answer. Bibsar shlomim askinon lo chazi la krova. The pasuk here, as it's interpreted by the Acherim, is talking about basar shlomim. Basar shlomim is eaten by the Baal HaKarma. It's not burnt on the Mizbeach. In such a case, if the basar became tameh, it's tameh forever and ever. The fact that it went onto the Mizbeach doesn't mean a thing. The Mizbeach can't in any way acquire, so to speak, ownership. That's my terminology. Onto basar that's designated for the achilas adam, to be consumed by man. Ravina has another answer. V'tumaso olav. Misha tuma parachas v'menu kshu sholem yotza basar shein tumaso parachas kshu sholem el kshu chasa. We're talking about tumaso olav, that the tumah could be removed, and it's only temporary because it can be removed without, without killing the person. You don't have to take off part of his body. But in the case of the meat, of a carbon, if it contracted tumah, that's permanent. You could burn part of it on the mizbeach, but then it's not sholem. We're talking about something that's sholem. Kufa, we go back now to discuss the price of pigul. And it says v'tumosa olav, and we didn't know exactly whether tumosa olav is a description of the basa, or it's a description of the gavra who's tamei. B'tumas haguf hakosu b'daber. The simple meaning is that the gavra is tamei. How do we know that? I told him b'tumas haguveda, it'll be tumas basa. Maybe you'll be very persistent and you'll play the devil's advocate and assume that the word tumosa olav is in the pasuk, because it says Tochel basar asher tumas olav, it's referring to the basar. Then we have to introduce a gzera shava. And what's the gzera shava? Nemar Khan here, with regard to the Easter of eating bituma. It says, it says tum also. V'nemar lahalon, when a person goes into the Beis Hamikdash and he's tamei. It also says tum also, and he's chayiv kares for going into the mikdash tamei. Is mala halon. We have gzeir shav tumas haguf hakos v'daber when talking about tumas olav, meaning that he went into the mikdash. It was tumas hagavra. So to here, by virtue of the gzeir shav, we're talking about tumas hagavra, tumas haguf. Rabbi Yossi Omar, another proof. Again, we're always trying to prove that tumas olav is referring to the gavra, not to the meat. Hoil v'nemru kodshe b'loshen rabim, v'nemru tuma b'loshen yochid, v'tumas haguf hakosu medaber. Right, the pasuk speaks b'loshen rabim with regard to the shlomim, but with regard to the tuma, it only says tumaso olav on him in the singular. Why doesn't it say tumaso b'aleim on the shlomim, on the basar? That's proof positive that we're talking about the gavra. The gavra is tamei, tumas haguf. Rebbe Omer, he has another proof. The ochal, v'tumas haguf hakos medaru. Meaningless. Makes no sense. Acherim, we'll come back to Rebbe in a minute. Acherim Amru, another proof that tumas olav is referring to tumas haguf. V'tumaso olav mishet tuma parachas mimenu. As we saw before, basa, once it became tamei, again, unless you burn it on top of the mizbeach and it's no longer sholem, it could never be ois tuma. Omar Mar, we have Rebbe Shita. What is Rebbe talking about? He says, "V'ochal betumas haguf hakos mitaber." What did Rebbe see in the word v'ochal? My mashma. Now, this gives an excuse for Rava to tell us about the greatness of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi, because he's the one who's going to interpret a brisa when we're totally stumped by the brisa. Kol kra. So he's going to give a compliment to Rav Dimi, and also to Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, and also to Rav Zera, I think. Zeiri. Okay. So it goes like this. Kol kradul and farshle. If you have a pasuk and you can't figure out what it is, unless you get an insight and a commentary on that pasuk from Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, then forget it. You'll never understand the pasuk. B'chol maslis in any brisa to lo farshle zeiri. If you don't get an elucidation that brisa from zeiri, lo mefarshne, you'll never understand the brisa. Okay. Hachi Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi holu pasuk. So now Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi is going to explain how we see in the pasuk that it's referring to tumas haguf. Holu pasach hakos b'loshen nekeva, v'siyim b'loshen nekeva l'loshen zocher be'emtza is b'tumas haguf hakos medaber. Okay. Now for this we have to see the psukim. It says hanefesh hashatiga. The word tiga is in feminine. b'chol tomei. Then it says v'ochal b'psar hashlam. V'ochal is in lashon zachar. It doesn't say ochla with a hey at the end. Asher l'shem nichrusa hanefesh ahi me'ameh nichrusa is in lashon nekeva. So it started with nekeva with the word tiga. It ends in nekeva with the word v'nichrusa, and in the middle it says v'ochal, which is lashon zachar. And that's going to prove to us, says Rebbe, that betumas hagufa kosu b'daber. We're not talking about tumas basar. Now, the basis for interpreting the verse as referring to tum of the basar is that it begins and ends by referring to the soul that eats the meat in the feminine form. And yet, the subject of the tumah is v'achal, is a masculine form. Rebbe therefore demonstrates that the very next verse, the pasuk that contains the same internal variation from nekeva to zachar, even though it clearly refers to the person. So the very next pasuk is going to talk about, going into the migdash, and it's going to start with a lashon nekeva. Okay, so that's as far as the pasuk is concerned to prove, based on Risabavavadimi, that it's referring to Tumas Haguf. Masnisa. What was this brisa that you said that we could never figure out the brisa without Zeiri? Desanya, we learned in the brisa. Okay, we're not doing too great on the clock, but we'll try to do the best we can. And if you have to shut off, you'll shut off, but we need another 10 minutes to finish the daf. What does the brisa say? Okay, we're talking about somebody who's tamei, and he eats something that's kodesh. Now, kodesh has different levels to it. The bottom level is called maser sheni, and then we go up to kodshim, which is much more chamur, because if a tamei eats maser sheni, he only gets malchus for violating a lav, but if a tamei eats basar kodshim, that's already a chiv misa bidei shamayim. And besides kodshim, there's also truma. Truma is much more chamur than maser sheni with regard to tuma. And this is sugya in Perka Orel in Yevamos. Im nemru kalos, lama nemru chamuros. Very strange brisa. The brisa asks, why does it mention the kal, and then why does it mention the chamur? Or, lama mentioned kalos. So now the brisa is spelling it out one by one. Im nemer kalos v'lo chamuros. The brisa says that it's impossible. Right now we think that kalos is referring to maser, and chumra is referring to truma and kodesh. Later on, the Gemara is going to switch it around, and kal is referring to too much sheretz, the nature of the tumah, not the nature of that which became tamei, and chamur is tumas mes. So if the Torah, says the Brisa, would have only mentioned kalos, which we think is referring to maser sheni, and not chumros, and not chamuros, meaning not basar kodesh and or truma, is ha'isi omer al kalos belav, v'al chamuros b'misa, which makes no sense because that's exactly true. So lekach nemer chamuros. So again, according to the strict interpretation, word for word of the brisa, the reason why the Torah added the chamuros, meaning basar kodesh and truma, is to tell you that if the tamei eats basar kodesh or basar truma, he gets misa b'dei shamayim. Im nemer chamuros. But if the Torah had only started with what? With kodshim and truma, which are called chamuros, below nemru kalson wouldn't have said anything about maser sheni. Hayisi omer, I would have said al chamuros yechayv al kalsi potter, that a tamei is allowed to eat maser sheni. We wouldn't have even known that there's any iser with a punishment for eating maser sheni b'tumah. Lekach nemru kalos, and therefore the Mishnah had to mention. The pasuk had to mention maser sheni. The Gemara says this. I don't understand this price. My kalos and my chamurus ilem kalos maser, and chamurus is truma or kachim. Hayisi omer b'misa. The Bryce is saying that if the Torah had only given me kalos, which is maser sheni, and then I would say that in the case of the chumrah of a tummy eating truma, he gets he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim, and the Torah is contrasting the kalos with the chamuros to say the kalos is only a violation of a lav if the tummy eats ma'aser sheni, and the chumras is if the tummy eats kachim or truma. Sfek the Gemara hashtanami b'misa. Well, what are you talking about? I would have come to the wrong conclusion. That's not the wrong conclusion. That's the correct conclusion. If a tummy eats truma or kachim, then he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. V'su, and furthermore, v'i lo nemar. What are you telling me? If the Torah wouldn't have said anything about a chumros, hayisi omer b'misa, I would come to the conclusion that if a tummy ate from kachim or from truma that he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim, dayel levamin adin liyas tanada. How would you derive such a conclusion? You're deriving it from maser sheni, which is kal. Maser sheni is only a lav without any punishment except for malchus, certainly not misa b'dei shamayim. How can you derive misa b'dei shamayim? We have a principle of dayel levamin adin liyas kalada. Ella, therefore we have to say no. What's kalos and what's chamuros in this brisa? Kalos must be referring to tumas sheretz. Tumas sheretz doesn't even require herev shemesh. All you need is to go into the mikvah. And chamuros is tumas mes. Right? Tumas mes requires that after 7 days you go to the mikvah, and then the next day you tar. Umay. And now, what is the brisa telling me? Okay, now we have to. Okay, so we've decided that kulos refers to tumas sheretz and chamuros refers to tumas mes. Okay, what are we eating now? What is the tummy eating? Ibit truma. If he's eating truma, idi ve'idi hu b'misa. Even if he's only tummy tumas sheretz, and he goes and eats truma, then he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So how can you call that kulos? Kulos means if I compare sheretz to tumas mes, then sheretz is more lenient than tumas mes. That's not so, because to the same extent, if a tamei mes eats truma, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So too, if a tamei sheretz eats truma, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. V'su, and furthermore, lekach nemar nemru chamuros. Why did it have to tell me the case of a tamei mes? Divalav. Are you telling me that you're saying that with regard to a tamei mes who eats kodesh, he only violates a lav? Habemisi. That's not true. He's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So if you're going to tell me that kalos and chamuros are referring to sheretz tuma as opposed to tumas mes, then we can't be referring to truma. Because if we're referring to truma, then even in the case of kalos, which is sheretz, nevertheless, a tamei sheretz who eats truma is chayav misa b'dei shamayim. The ibachilas maser, and here we're going to have to stop for today. We'll turn just to daf mem daled. Im lo nemru chamuros hayisi omer ala chamuros b'misa. Okay, so this will we're already 5 minutes over time. We'll have to stop here. But so tomorrow, I'll have to backtrack again just to, plug us into this takeoff of kalos and chamuros. If kalos is referring to tumas sheretz and chamuros to tumas mes. Okay, then. So wishing you a great day. Thank you so much.